Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Healer Build Breakdown, the series where we take an in-depth look at some of the many healing builds found in the Elder Scrolls Online. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this special episode, we'll be talking about the Ulti-Spam builds popularized by the legendary Eigh1 Puppies. Let's get into this. So yes, you heard that right. I said builds, as in plural. We'll be talking about two builds today, two-ish, both similar, but with key differences, and very different use cases in my opinion. In order to avoid making this the longest video on my channel, I will be doing a sort of build summary rather than a full build guide like I usually do. I'll still go over everything and give all of my flex choices and whatnot, but I won't be going quite as in-depth with my reasoning as I normally do. If you would like a much deeper explanation, as I mentioned previously, Eigh1 Puppies was the first channel I saw to actually reveal this build, and he already does a fantastic job of explaining why he chose the things that he did in his video, which I will link in the description for you guys. Okay, I think that's enough about that. Let's start by talking about the barrier spam build. So the point of these builds today are to do exactly what they sound like, which is to spam as many ultimates as possible. We do this by generating ultimate, but more so by focusing on reducing the cost of our ultimate through sets, class passives, and maybe even our choice in race. Speaking of race, I'd recommend your choice of race be the Breton for the extra sustain, the Nord for the extra ultimate generation, or the Imperial for the extra ability cost reduction. For your class lines, I'd recommend going with Siphoning from the Nightblade for the ultimate generation, Curative Runiforms from the Arcanist for its shield cost reduction passive, and then we have our flex spot. Now, your best choice here is going to be the Daedric Summoning skill line from the Sorcerer for its ultimate cost reduction passive, but as you can see, I am using Dawn's Wrath, and I think all of these other skill lines are perfectly acceptable choices as well. For attributes, we've put all 64 into Magicka as we normally do, and for our Mundus Stone, I'm currently using the Ritual. Since this build does utilize the Pearls of El-Nafe Mythic, we don't want our recovery to be too high. However, the Atronach is also a perfectly viable option if you can make it work with pearls. For food, I'd recommend either the Clockwork Citrus Fillet from the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge quest, or for a cheaper option, the Witch Mother's Potent Brew, which can easily be bought from guild traders. For potions, I'd recommend going with Heroism for the minor heroism buff, but you can also use Spell Power, try Restoration, or even just some basic Magicka potions. For our champion perk, starting with our blue tree, we have From the Brink, Soothing Tide, Swift Renewal, and then you can either use Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. For our red tree, we have Rejuvenation, Slippery or Celerity, then a couple new ones that we haven't talked about on the channel before, those being Shield Master, which will reduce the cost of all damage shields we cast, and Bastion, which will increase the effectiveness of all shields we cast. For skills, starting on our front bar Restoration Staff, we have Healthy Offering from the Siphoning skill line for the minor mending buff and ultimate generation, Combat Prayer from the Restoration Staff line for the minor Berserk and minor Resolve buffs, Illustrious Healing from the Restoration Staff line for the great AoE healing, Chakram of Destiny from the Curative Runiform skill line to generate Crux and activate the passive that reduces our ultimate cost, Radiating Regeneration from the Restoration Staff line for a great heal over time. Then for our first ultimate, we have Reviving Barrier from the Support skill line. Now, most commonly, you will see Replenishing Barrier actually recommended here instead of Reviving Barrier, but I do still prefer Reviving, and I'll explain why after I finish up the build summary. For our back bar Destruction Staff, we have Siphoning Attacks from the Siphoning line for great control over our Magicka and Stamina, Wall of Elements from the Destruction Staff line to keep our back bar enchantment going, Purifying Light from the Dawn's Wrath skill line for the ultimate generation, Overflowing Altar from the Undaunted line for the minor lifesteal, Echoing Vigor from the Assault line to proc Powerful Assault, and finally, our back bar ultimate is a total flex spot. I have Glyphic of the Tides there, just in case we ever decide we want to use it, but you can use whatever you want to there. And finally, for this build, we'll talk about sets, traits, and enchantments. The sets that I'm running are Spell Power Cure from the White Gold Tower Dungeon, Powerful Assault from the Imperial City or Guild Traders, the Pearls of Elnafay mythic, and actually, no monster set. Instead of a monster set, we have Powerful Assault in these spots, which leaves us just enough room to run the Blessing of Potentate set, which is a 3-piece set from Cyrodiil that reduces the cost of our ult even further. One thing to note is that you'll commonly see Potentates on the back bar and Powerful Assault on the front bar. I'm doing it the opposite just because I got used to having Powerful Assault on my back bar, so it feels familiar to me, but you can run it whichever way is most comfortable to you. You don't have to follow my way exactly. For our armor, I have all Divines, but remember, using Infused on big pieces is okay too, and those enchantments will be all Max Magicka. For our jewelry, the best combination would be to use the Infused trait and the Potion cooldown reduction enchantments to take advantage of the Catalyst passive from the Siphoning line. However, if you choose not to use that setup for one reason or another, you can always use the Arcane trait and a combination of Magicka recovery and spell damage enchantments. For our restoration staff, I'm using the Decisive trait for more ultimate generation, but the Powered trait for more healing is fine too. That enchantment can either be Absorb Magicka or Berserker. Finally, our Destruction staff will have the Infused trait and either the Crushing or Berserker enchantments. And that was it for the barrier spam build. Up next we have, well, I'm just gonna call it the Atro spam build because that's how I have mine set up, but really you can use this setup to spam Storm Atronach, Glacial Colossus, Warhorn, whatever you want. Now, fortunately, this build is nearly identical to the barrier spam build with some key differences, so I won't talk your ear off and repeat every single part of the build that I just covered. Instead, I'll just go over the things that you'd have to change from the barrier build. The first difference being your class lines. This time, you'll want Siphoning and Dawn's Wrath. Then, for your flex spot, it will mostly depend on which ultimate you want to bring. I've got Daedric Summoning for the Storm Atronach ultimate, which will allow our teammates to use a synergy to grant them Major Berserk. You could also take the Gravelord line for the Glacial Colossus ultimate to hit a large amount of enemies with major vulnerability. For the rest of the flex spots, I honestly might just take Warhorn as my ultimate, but again, you can coordinate with your team, figure out what you need, figure out what you want to use, all that good stuff. The next difference is our champion points. Since we're not using barrier, we no longer need Shield Master or Bastion, so we go back to slotting Boundless Vitality and Fortified as we do on most other builds. The next difference is a couple of skills. Obviously, we traded out Barrier for Storm Atronach from the Daedric Summoning line. Again, you can also use other ults like Glacial Colossus or Warhorn or whatever your group would prefer. Then, I'm using Energy Orb in place of Chakram of Destiny, and I also traded Overflowing Altar for Bound Aegis. You can just kind of coordinate which healer has Altar and Energy Orb and all that. This is just how I did it by default. Customize it to whatever you need to. For your backbar ultimate, I'm running Barrier just in case I need it, but you can use whatever you want there. Everything else is exactly the same as the Barrier build. One thing I like is that with how similar these two builds are, an ultimate spam build can be very versatile in a lot of different scenarios. And speaking of that, let's talk about where you might find use for these two builds. Now, I mentioned in the build summary section that I would talk about why I use reviving over replenishing barrier, even though replenishing barrier results in more total casts. That's because if you were to perfectly min-max the build exactly the same way that Puppies talked about in his video, you can get a barrier, I think, every 12 to 15 seconds, somewhere in that range. It's a lot of barriers. The question, though, is do you really need a barrier? We'll say every 15 or even 20 seconds. Someone can correct me if I'm mistaken, but I'd say probably not for most encounters in the game. Where the barrier build does shine, though, and why I love it so much, is being able to have a barrier at key points in any encounter to overcome any sort of high incoming damage. Think of the shrapnel mechanic from Ysela in Sanity's Edge hard mode. It's a textbook heal check that can very easily be trivialized with a well-placed barrier. However, that mechanic only happens at certain percentages of boss health and then every 50 seconds or so during execute phase. 50 seconds is more than enough time to get a barrier ready regardless of whether or not it's reviving or replenishing, so I think I'd personally rather take reviving for the extra healing that it provides. All of this to say that In my opinion, the barrier spam build is a fantastic build for random groups or progression groups, or even in some encounters for score pushing groups. But in my humble opinion, I think that it's better utilized for making sure that you always have a barrier for specific heal checks and mechanics. Next, we have the Atro, Colo, Horn, whatever else you want to spam build. I'm going to be honest with you guys, I think this seriously might be one of my favorite builds in the game. It is genuinely so much fun, and I'd say that it will probably find the most use in very low-end and very high-end content. In a normal trial, where you're just farming some gear and there really isn't a whole lot of incoming damage, this can be a great way to provide some extra damage for your team. And in very high-end content, such as score pushing, I could see this being used by some groups as a way to keep a higher uptime on major berserk or major vulnerability. The best part about both this build and the barrier spam build that I wanted to talk about here is that since this build has a healer on both Spell Power Cure and Powerful Assault, this now opens up some gear slots for both a healer and a tank. Meaning that if more groups adopt this build or a barrier build, we may start to see more casual groups drop Rojo and begin adopting the Master Architect and War Machine combination that endgame players have been using for a little while now. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about that in a later video. For now, that was all we had for this episode of Healer Build Breakdown. As always, I hope you enjoyed the video and found it useful. I've still got a few more build updates coming to you guys, as well as a Zeal of Zenithar guide, so make sure to subscribe so you don't miss those. Also, make sure to check out Eigh1 Puppies video over these builds if you haven't already. Like I said, I've linked it in the description, so please go watch that. I'd also like to take a moment to thank my Patreon supporters Dylan Stewart and Charnene Lee, as well as my YouTube members King Gingy, Durgy, Insert Username, and Eric from Ohio. Thank you guys for continuing to support me, and I'm sending y'all a virtual high five. Think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others, don't forget to check out my link tree in the description, and I will catch y'all in the next one.